Policy Talk is a discussion forum that brings perspectives and analytical frameworks to bear on some of the outstanding public policy issues of our times. The purpose is to expand the universe of possible alternatives and extend one's range of curiosity by bringing different viewpoints to the public policy discourse. Public policy researchers want to understand why policy decisions and their outcomes change, stay stable, vary from sector to sector, and differ in their consequences for the public. It is a distinctive and problematic area of study and tends to include in its baseline all political activity and institutions, from voting, political cultures, parties, legislatures, bureaucracies, international agencies, local governments, and back again to the citizens at the receiving end. Global Policy Talk will specially examine the challenges of democracy and the peculiarities of an open model of decision making. Incrementalism and self-correction are its hallmarks, and as opposed to the regimented and closed models of non-democracies, where the public is rarely a participant in the policy process. We will discuss why some issues are taken up for action and some are ignored, emphasizing, as truisms do, that public policy relates to the political construction of problems that are picked up for public action. Attempts have been made by researchers to explore what shapes policy narratives while being constrained by them at the same time. This was broadly the rationale for us in the Center for Public Policy and Governance, Institute of Social Sciences, New Delhi, to initiate the Global Policy Talk series from March 2022. The theme I've chosen for discussion on International Women's Day today with Professor Meghna Sabharwal from the University of Texas, USA, is the issue of women and work. If women constitute roughly half the population of the globe, then bridging gender gaps constitute the most important development issue in the world today. One of the facts of life that we take for granted and which does not rivet our attention always is the near universal practice of gender discrimination and the fact that there is no truly gender just society anywhere in the world. It was centuries of gender injustice that finally led women in the West to start their fight for equality and rights, initially focusing on civil and political rights. Much later, in the Soviet Union and the socialist world, women got constitutionally guaranteed social and economic rights. Right to food, education, healthcare, work, and the right to enjoy one's personal income. In India and many other countries of the third world, the women's movements have battled for three entitlements: freedom from social and cultural restrictions, equality of opportunities, and empowerment through a package of gender-specific rights. Empowerment is a buzzword today, and economic empowerment is the bedrock on which other kinds of empowerment rests. So I think the word empowerment is being still debated in both academic and non-academic fora. To me, it means the capability to make independent choices on key aspects of one's life: education, marriage, employment, reproduction, or the right to spend one's income in one's way. In this sense, how many of us women sitting here today and watching this show can truly say we are empowered? It was thought of at one time that an educated working woman is automatically empowered to make such choices. But in India, as elsewhere, this is not always the case. There are visible and invisible barriers. Besides, educated women, working women may also be victims of domestic violence. Let me, however, state that women in India have made giant strides towards empowerment with every generation. So therefore, I'll stop here and let me introduce our guest for tonight, my good friend, Professor Meghna Sabharwal, who will we will be in a conversational mode, and I'll be asking a couple of questions to her, and of course, she's there to give you her take on the same issues on which I would have spoken also. Now, let me introduce her. Dr. Meghna Sabharwal is a professor in the public and non-profit management program at the University of Texas at Dallas, USA. Her research is focused on public human resources management, specifically workforce diversity, equity and inclusion, comparative HR, and high skilled immigration. She has published 3 books and 60 peer reviewed journal articles and is the winner of 4 Best Paper Awards. She has presented in over 200 national and international conferences. She is the recipient of the 2021 Outstanding Public HR Scholar Award by the Section on Personnel Administration and Labor Relations, American Society of Public Administration. She is the current chair of the oldest section of ASPA, section on international and comparative administration, SICA. She has chaired the section of Women in Public Administration and the South Asian section of Public Administration of ASPA. She is the associate editor of the Review of Public Personnel Administration and Public Integrity. So, hi, Meghna. Welcome to our Policy Talk series on International Women's Day. Let's begin with a couple of questions for you. The theme for today, as we've already discussed before, and I just said, it's women and work. I hope you can take up as many questions related to the issue, not only to, because it's a very, very important issue to be discussed for International Women's Day this year. My questions are, tell us first a little about yourself, your areas of specialization at the University of Texas at Dallas, School of Economic, Political and Policy Sciences. How would you introduce your school to us?
Thank
Yes,
you,
it's your turn.
firstly. Thank you, Rumki, for that very nice and warm introduction and welcome. You've been a wonderful friend, not only a friend, but even mentor in many ways. So I really thank you for that. I'm happy to have this conversation with you today. I'd like to wish all the audiences listening a very happy International Women's Day. I hope we have not just women in the audience, but also men listening to these important conversations. Just to talk a little bit about myself, you've mentioned a lot, but I do consider myself a public human resource scholar, as you mentioned. The central focus of my research is diversity, equity, and inclusion. I also have done studies on the LGB community in the workplace and other minoritized groups such as immigrants. I also work on cross-cultural public management issues. I've currently working, I'm on a sabbatical, and I'm working on 2 books actually related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, hopefully to be done by the end of this year. So I'm excited about that. And my mind is very much and steeped on in these areas and topic as I'm writing the book. I'm also very keenly interested. My lot of my studies have been done on women and leadership, and my talk today and my our conversation probably would be around a lot of those issues of women in the workplace and leadership. Yeah, I've been working with UT Dallas now, University of Texas at Dallas, for almost 15 years. I started there as an assistant professor in 2009. I graduated with a PhD from Arizona State University. I got my master's there as well from Arizona State, and then went on to do a year of postdoctoral fellow at City University of New York. So it's been a fantastic journey since I left India almost 23 years ago, where I got my undergraduate degree in a different discipline, but agriculture. So it's been a great journey so far for me here. And then, of course, I'm proud to say I'm from India and born Indian. UTD, you asked me to talk a little bit about the university itself. And University of Texas at Dallas is actually a very young institution. We are only about 53 years old. That's young for US institutions. And we've consistently ranked among the top schools for under 50 years. And so that's been a exciting thing for me personally to be part of this university that's growing. When I started in 2009, we were about 12 to 13,000 students. Currently, we have 31,000 students from all over the globe. And I'll be proud to even say that we have the most number of international students that are coming from India, actually. So it's a very diverse school and program. The program that I am in is in public and nonprofit management. And we've had some excellent ranking of our program. Our program's doing very well. We are ranked number one in the North Texas region, actually number third in Texas itself. And what's the big deal if you're ranked third in Texas? I would say, hey, Texas can be a known country in itself. It's if you had to rank Texas as a country, it probably is the 40th largest in the world out of 193 nations. So it is a big state, as you know, and we are ranked third there in Texas and about 56th in the nation out of 180 programs. For a program that just started, the PhD only started 20 years ago. So it's a young program, and then we've been doing excellently well. So if anybody is interested to know more about the program or possibly get a degree in public and nonprofit management, I encourage you to visit our website. It is utdallas.edu//PNM. PNM is for public and nonprofit management. So utdallas.edu/PNM, you can learn more about the program there. Thank you.
Um, Based on your research on women and leadership in the public sector, which is what you
Mm-hmm,
stated right now,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
uh, uh, I think you could really venture on these questions which I have for
mm-hmm,
you. What
mm-hmm,
is gender-based stereotypes that women experience at work,
mm-hmm,
home, school, or society? Are
mm-hmm,
there some theoretical explanations of these stereotypes? This is what
mm-hmm.
bothers me, and perhaps you could speak a little about that.
Sure. That's a great question, Rumki. I think stereotypes are everywhere, whether we are here in the US or India or any other part of the world. Firstly, when we use the word gender itself, I'd like to start off by mentioning the term gender is a socially constructed concept, as we know. So it's not limited to the binary of just men or women. And so it's neither static, as we know, and so it exists on a continuum and it evolves, right? Whether it's gender expression, gender identity, these issues. But oftentimes, I think we like to put things in very neat little boxes and we alienate a large proportion who may not identify on the binary. But of course, today I'll talk about more about gender stereotypes related specifically to women. But I wanted to kind of set the tone by saying it is not a binary as we often think in our minds. But having said that, I would say, gender stereotypes, like I said, are everywhere. They are plaguing all societies. It sets kind of the expectation for how men and women should behave, maybe at work. How should they dress at work? How should they conduct themselves? Um, and these kinds of such stereotypes that and expectations that we place both of our men and women then kind of go into how we define workplaces, what kinds of roles women may have in the workplaces. As you know, there are common gender stereotypes for women, that they should be very polite, for instance, or nurturing, not too aggressive, or outspoken. They should be responsible for housekeeping or childcare or any caregiving activities, and that's associated more with women, and not just in India but in many parts of the world, including in the US. And so these common gender stereotypes are also there for men. Men have to be strong and aggressive, or they don't have to be participating in childcare, for instance. They just have to be the providers, not necessarily taking part in the household chores. And so these kinds of differences exist across societies. And in fact, I would say that I think the pandemic exacerbated some of these. They magnified some of these differences. We clearly saw women almost on a double shift, right? They had to work. The working women, for instance, they had to work and also at the same time take care of the household responsibilities. So that's one of the things that we see. And oftentimes what happens is women have to choose between a career or a family. Some of them are forced to choose, right? And then that's kind of the penalty some of them may pay for choosing motherhood, for instance, because our workplaces may not be designed to kind of nurture that women can have both these roles, not choose one or the other. But sadly enough, we know that most women are forced to pick one over the other, and they're constantly penalized for their choices, and we've seen that. This one of them is being the motherhood penalty I was talking about. um, and then these preconceived gender roles that we have created, right, in the society, then I think they limit individuals from pursuing what they want to do, their professional careers, or making individual choices about their own lives, because then there are other norms that are expected and that are placed generally on women. That also I have seen leads to some gendering in the workplace, or gendering of occupations. For instance, as women are more likely to be seen as, say, teachers in the social work, human resources. All of these are very um, women dominated uh, spaces, whereas we see that men may dominate spaces like finance, economics, transportation. Those kinds of are seen as very masculine um, organizations. And so I've studied that and over time, and it's very interesting to see how these things then impact careers of women, or how do they impact even the inequities, say, in pay, or even the status or the importance we place on certain disciplines, um, based on that gendering that I've seen. Um, Another thing I would say is women in spaces that are very male dominant, for instance, leadership is seen as a very male dominant space. But when we do see women in these kinds of leadership roles, oftentimes they may not be taken seriously for their work, or they have to maybe even adopt a very male like persona, where they may have to dress like a man, or talk like a man, or behave like them, maybe being more aggressive. So those kinds of things sometimes women have to adopt, and we see that across societies. We see that across organizations, in our places of work, at our schools. All of these things, we do see these patterns. Um, and I've done a few studies, and I remember actually in one of my study where I was interviewing women in local government. These are women in city government roles, managers, directors, and one of them actually said that women are constantly under a microscope. Two strikes and you're out. That's what she said exactly. And she said there was no room for error. So this constant placing these expectations on women that are different actually from men, because men are able to get away with a lot more. They have more leeway. Whereas women, she was saying, have to be almost perfect, and then juggling across all these various roles, and to a point that you have to be perfect in all of these. And so that's a lot of stress. There's mental health issues that leads to that. And then eventually women do face all obstacles when it comes to going into some of these leadership positions, because of these long established, I think, inequalities, biases, and these stereotypes that we see in the workplace. I'm happy to go into some of the theories. I don't know if you had a follow-up question, but I'm happy to go into the theory.
Yes, maybe
Okay.
you could take them up with the follow-up question. Um, You know how now that you did say that you've done a lot of research on women
Yeah.
in leadership roles,
Mm.
how would you look at the global picture of women in leadership positions? What exactly
Mm.
is your understanding of the glass ceiling metaphor? I mean,
Mm.
maybe you link it
Mhm.
up with your theories or whatever, and
Sure.
that's a good question.
Sure. That's a good question. Before I go into, of course, speaking about the glass ceiling, and then the global picture for women, there clearly are some of these theories that will help our understanding of these concepts. So one that is interesting and it has been used widely is called the think manager, think male. And so when you think of a manager, you're thinking of a man, right? So this was an experiment that was done long time ago, but then repeated again. So the experiment, when it was done by this professor, Virginia Shane, in 1975, she did this. She had both sets of male and female managers, and she gave them about 92 or so characteristics to rate. And it was interesting to see that both male and female managers actually rated what leaders look like as a very masculine trait. For instance, some of the descriptors they ranked highly that should be in a leader are they should be aggressive, they should possess leadership abilities, self-reliant, very competitive, very objective, ambitious, forceful in their negotiations. All of these that we can relate to as a very masculine trait. Um, Very interestingly, she repeated this experiment about 15 years later or so, in 1990. And then what she found was that men continue to hold these stereotypes, whereas women no longer held such stereotypes. They kind of viewed both men and women to possess traits that would make them successful managers, not necessarily those traits that we associate with men, but also nurturing, emotional intelligence, those kinds of very important things that we know of today. um, and so that was an interesting experiment, and I think that informs how even maybe men leaders may view women uh, today, and what kind of a lens they are using. Another theory that has been widely researched, has been widely talked about, put forward by Professor Eagley, Alice Eagley, and Karau, who've done a lot of work in this, is the social role theory. And social role, as you know, is what are the roles that we place for both men and women in a society. And what they argue is that these leadership styles that we know of for men and women are based on two things. Men are associated with something called agentic traits, the traits I was talking about, the forceful, the self-reliant, the assertiveness, the aggressiveness. Those are very agentic uh, traits demonstrated by men. And on the other hand, women demonstrate communal behaviors. They are gentle, they are kind, they affectionate, empathetic, warm, nurturing, caring, sensitive, helpful. All of these are these communal traits. And so there's an expectation that men should be agentic and women should exhibit communal traits. And these expectations, I think, hurt both men and women, because there may be women who may exhibit certain traits that are very agentic in nature, and vice versa. We may have men who may demonstrate traits that are very communal in nature. So it hurts both of them because we've kind of associated. So that's the social role association, and that we see in play out in our studies too, whether it be glass cliff, which I'll talk about, or glass ceiling. Um, and then the last thing, Eagley and Karau also came up with something called um, role congruity theory, right? Because there has to be congruity between what we expect of women, say in the society, or men in the society, and then what we see of women. So if we see that women are in leadership roles, there's an incongruity that arises because we expect women to be more of these communal traits, and leadership associated with very agentic traits. So there's an incongruity that arises there, and then these perceptions that we hold further then hurt women, whether it be when they are going up for promotions, they are faced with this invisible barrier, right, that we know of as glass ceiling. In fact, another example I remembered of role incongruity that one of my participant in another of my studies mentioned. She said and she was in an upper leadership position in the government, in the city government or the municipal government. And she said that in upper level leadership positions, you are expected to perform above and beyond at work. And at the same time, you're also expected to perform at home as well. So she said for women, that's almost impossible because we are placing too many expectations and for them to then exceed and do well. So all of these metaphors that we know of, right, whether it's glass ceiling, glass walls, sticky floors, glass escalators, or even glass cliffs that I'll talk about. All of these they help explain these barriers that women are faced with, whether they want to aspire to be in leadership roles or not. But generally in the workplace, they do face this. Um, Globally, I think you asked me also is what's the global picture of women, right? In the what do I see as the global? Globally, I think it depends. If you look at the state heads around the world, out of 193 state heads, only 22 currently are women. So clearly, there's a gap there, right? Um, if you look at US, I'm thinking about the Congress, which is that you know when you think about the lower house and upper house, if I had to translate that in the Indian terms. But 28% of women are in Congress. And then the upper house, which is the Senate, we only have about 24% of women in the US Senate too. Um, Even in nonprofits, which is traditionally thought of as a very women dominated, right? The non-governmental sector as we know it in India. So even nonprofit, at the very top, if you see, it's only 20% women for large nonprofits. Um, Likewise, I think the government does a slightly better job, at least if in the US too, when we have these senior executive roles in the government for women, it's 34%. Whereas if you look at the Fortune 500 companies, only barely 7% are women CEOs. I'll give you a fun fact here. In fact, there are more number of leaders by the first name John, or one of those that are very typical of leaders here in the US, for instance. So there you have more number of John than you have women who are leaders in actually Fortune 500. So again, there's a stereotype even associated with names, for instance, right? Kind of going back to that. But so that's where the globally, I think, whether it's nonprofit, whether it's the public sector or private sector, we clearly see a gap of women in leadership roles. I did recently a paper that was published in Public Administration Journal for the 100th anniversary, and we did about 5 different vignettes of any of these DEI issues. And I chose to write the vignette on the women in Indian civil service. And so it was interesting to even note there that the percentage of women in administrative services, as in India, stands at about 21%. And if you look at those secretary level, like the very top of the administrative services, you only have 4 out of 70 secretaries that are women too. And if you further intersect it with, say, religion, I don't think there are any religious minorities within that 4 as well. So when we talk about just women, we have to also remember, especially in any context. In the US, we intersected with, say, race or class, and in India, we'll have to think about religion or caste or any of these other minoritized identities, that when we further start intersecting them, the numbers get further smaller and smaller. So if you're interested, go look at that piece. But the other piece also that I recently published in a new journal we have in the field, if our scholars or anybody listening there want to publish, I would encourage them to look at the Journal of Social Equity in Public Administration. It's called JSEPA. It's a new journal. But the inaugural issue, I had a piece there on gender inequities in current day India. And so that's something too that may shed light on some of these issues we've been talking about, but more specifically from an Indian context. Um, I'm happy to go on talking about some of the glass cliff. Rumki, did you have any follow up?
Yes, let me speak in the Indian context. That's important because I expected you,
Sure.
and you did speak about the global context. And there's so much that you said,
Yeah.
which is really interesting. In the Indian context, let me say that the Indian Constitution, of course, has guaranteed equality of status and opportunities for men and so, and that was so, then where did things go wrong in India? Because I have the statistics with me, and let's look at some of the hard facts which I researched, and I did get these facts. Uh, 92% of women can earn less than 10,000 a month,
Mm.
10,000 rupees a month.
Yes.
Only a third of women work, and for only a third of a man's pay. At
Mm.
16%, India's female labor force participation rate is among the lowest in the world. Prior to the pandemic, it was 21%. 127th is India's rank in the Gender Inequality Index out of 195 countries, and 149th is India's rank in the Gender Development Index, which is also
Mhm.
out of 195 countries. Now,
Mhm.
women do 10 times more unpaid care work than
Mhm.
men. In the World Economic Forum Gender Gap Index, which is really what everybody
Mhm.
looks at
Mhm.
these
Mhm.
days, India's rank is 135 among
Yeah.
146
Yeah.
countries in 2022.
Yeah.
So, the decline of women in the
Yeah.
labor force
Yeah.
from 2004 to 5 is one of, let's say, India's enduring mysteries.
Mm.
Why would women, and that bothers me, across demography, geography, and income, quit paid work in such large numbers? Why
Mm.
would they quit when educational attainment was up, fertility
Mm.
was down, and the economy was
Mm.
growing? So
Mm.
the decline in unemployment rate for women indicates that all researchers prove that they're not necessarily moving from an unemployed status to an employed status, but out of the
Mm.
labor force altogether. Now, there are
Mm.
numerous theories. Some of the
Mhm.
common ones are that women quit paid work because they want to study, they
Mm.
want to modernize, they want to update
Mhm.
their skills. They also
Mhm.
leave because of the burden of housework. They quit
Mhm.
because of a lack of structural support, including affordable and safe transportation. These are
Mm.
some of the common theories
Mhm. Mhm.
that have been given
Mhm.
by
Mhm.
scholars. But
Mhm.
my point is, this is an issue which should really we should care
Yeah.
about, because
Yeah.
if, again, I go by the statistics, it
Mhm.
said that if women participated in the economy in India on a par with
Mhm.
men, it would push
Mhm.
the gross domestic product up by 60% instead of the
Mm.
present
Mhm.
18% or less.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
we should care because we are the
Mhm.
world's largest democracy, where women
Mhm.
should be equal partners in decision
I get.
making in society,
Mhm.
economy, and politics. Now,
Mhm.
there's something else which I wish to point out. This is interesting. India aims to become a $5 trillion economy by 2025.
Mm.
China, which started from a similar base in the late 1970s, today has an economy 4 times larger than India's. We have to focus on the fact, and which is interesting, that while the male labor force participation rates in the two countries are fairly similar, their female labor force participation rates are vastly different. While
mm,
China while China is more than in China it's more than 60%. Uh, it's higher than the figure for the world and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development.
mhm,
India's FLFPR is abysmally low. So the
mm,
big gap in the size of the female workforce is a critical fact that we
mm,
should bother about. Now,
mhm,
let me come to some questions for you, Meghna. Having stated the statistics in India,
mhm,
which does bother me, why
mhm,
do skilled and unskilled women in all societies across the
mm,
world quit jobs from time to time? What is the factor impacting glass ceiling?
mm,
What happens
mm,
to those women who break the ceiling? Do you have a career
mm,
model for women in the private and public sector?
mm,
I'm just asking you. You can answer them in whichever order you wish
mm,
to. And
mm,
how does
mm,
one make the workplace more inclusive or remove
mm,
discrimination? These are
mm,
related questions. You can take them in
mhm.
whichever order you wish.
Sure.
Meghna.
Sure. I appreciate you mentioning those statistics for India, and that was very concerning, honestly, to me as I was writing that piece on the rising gender inequities in India. And I think one has to look at, you can't just look at one because it's a puzzle, as you said, but there are many pieces to it, correct? And I think I looked at historical, cultural, political, economic. So I think we really have to go in deep dive into some of these. India is, and I won't harp too much on India. You certainly are there and you do more research, but just the paper that I was doing, as you mentioned, violence against women has risen. You know, again, some of these uh, you have the rape case numbers and other violence, domestic issues. Also, as you said, women may want to go back to study, and which is fine, but we are not seeing that translate into the workforce, right? Those numbers are definitely quite concerning. India, as we know, is definitely still a patriarchal society, although we've seen women make enormous strides, like you said. But I think that that cultural aspect, historical aspect, remains where we do see, um, men dominating many spaces in this kind of patriarchy. And then women have to make certain choices, right? When it comes to work, as I was saying. Now, kind of going back to that question of why do skilled and unskilled women quit jobs from time to time, right? There's this interesting model called ramp off and ramp on. Ramp is, when you're going on a highway or something, you take a ramp, right? And then you exit. If you want to exit, you ramp off. And then when you want to get on the speed, you go on the ramp, right? So that's that ramp off and ramp on. But what it is saying is most women, if you think about the skilled in professional careers, at some point in their career, may have to take a break or kind of exit that fast lane. They may not completely exit the workforce, they may have to slow down because of certain demands, whether it is raising children or if you have to care for elderly parents. All that unpaid care work, as you were saying, right? Or sometimes these working long hours or working with a lot of travel, those kinds of may not work well for women because, again, remember that social role theory that places expectations on women to do kind of both and do it both perfectly. And so these women sometimes choose to go off the ramp. Right, they choose to temporarily exit. They want to come back, but temporarily they exit. Now, what happens is when they want to come back, they are faced with a penalty. So there was a study by Harvard Business Review. They actually found that women's earning power actually dips to about 28% when they take time off. And the longer you are out of the labor market, the penalty keeps increasing, correct? So across sectors, that study found that women lose 37% of their earning power when they spend 3 or more years out of the workforce. So clearly, again, you see that penalty when women want to quit job or they quit and they want to come back. Um, and as we said, these gender norms are clearly changing, but women continue to shoulder a disproportionate amount of caregiving work. And as you pointed out, being unpaid, clearly, even during the pandemic, we saw, as I mentioned, 1 in 3 actually in a study said they decided to leave the workforce due to these double shift responsibilities. So a lot of women choose to leave the workforce during the pandemic too. Now, these women want to come back in, and they will be faced with some sort of a penalty. It will be either harder to find a job or harder to go back to that similar role or position. They may be faced with a wage penalty, clearly. So there are a lot of these disadvantages that women have when they they want to quit a job or they come back due to some of these responsibilities that are shouldered on women, and the expectations that women have to even do that without help and without support. It's very, very hard. When I had my child, and I was on tenure track years, right? I'm still working to make tenure. So I was assistant professor, and oftentimes women are even advised not to have kids during assistant professor years, which is so wrong. At least, that was the norm. I'm talking about 15, 20 years ago, is that was what we were advised. And so when I had my child, there was no way I could do what I did, my research, my teaching, my travels, conferences, if I didn't have support. Now I do stand in a point of privilege. I have the privilege that I could afford somebody who could come take care. There are many in the world, in fact, the most don't have that kind of privileges. And so they have to choose, and they choose to leave. And that's when quitting that work it's very hard for them. Now, some of these, you even mentioned low skilled. Low skilled labor are not, sometimes their work is not amenable to working from home, for instance. And that, I think, creates an additional layer of challenge where they have to be there in person. And so now who's going to take care of caregiving? In the US, at least, childcare is extremely expensive. um, Also, workplace policies are not sometimes flexible. You have unpaid leave. The childcare, as I said, is unaffordable. There's this workplace, almost this, bias that we hold against women who may even choose to have kids, because then we don't take them seriously, or we think they are not serious enough about their career. And so all of these things, I think, together combine to form some of the challenges that we see, whether it is, breaking through the ceiling, and then what happens to women, as you said, um, who break the ceiling. So I'm happy to talk about, unless you have a follow up, about what happens to women who break through the ceiling.
Um, again, I speak largely on the Indian context because I have the figures with me, and
Sure.
I'm aware of the government policies and other policies in the private sector that are being followed. In India, we have to admit that the state has been proactive in promoting the rights of women. So, in the organized public sector, personnel policies have maintained gender equality to a large extent, and the government has been a model employer, upholding the principle of equal pay for equal work. The rights based approach to development, and that's something we've been talking about for a long time, that's also helped to a certain extent, because whether it's the right to food, education, or work in rural areas, uh, they do make a difference for women. The reservation policy followed at the local government level has made a difference, certainly because 1 million women have entered the third tier of governance, the panchayats. So, even Manrega, the largest social sector program in the world, which guarantees work in rural areas, has been women empowering on the whole. So, not only large numbers of women have been employed now, in the sense of, which has enabled them to open bank accounts in their own names. The Manrega has helped women from migrating to urban areas in search of work. Then there are self-help groups and rural banks, which have also helped rural women in self-employment through dispensing of microcredit facilities. So these policies, whether followed by the government or the non-profit sector or the private sector, have been helpful. But Mm, it's the unorganized sector, what we call the unorganized sector or the private sector, the informal sector, as it is said in India, which happen to be and will continue to be the largest employers and job
Mhm,
creators in the Indian market. And
mhm,
that is
mhm,
where things have to change.
mhm,
For example, agriculture is the largest private activity in this country. Women in
mhm,
agricultural families are often neither paid for their work or given land
mhm,
rights. In other
mhm,
non-skilled or semi-skilled jobs in the private industrial or manufacturing sector, there are no gender just labor laws like equal pay for
mhm,
equal work. But I must say that in the corporate sector, things have been changing. You know, they do have good women oriented personnel policies like maternity benefits, work from home, sabbatical, and, a hybrid model, especially tried out during the COVID time, the pandemic period,
mhm,
which was helpful for women. So, the corporate sector has changed. Now, the government, what it tries to do or is trying to do in India is trying consistently to formalize the informal sector. That is, to
mhm,
bring the unorganized sector under the ambit of public sector like labor laws.
mhm,
That's the effort of the government. So, you know, uh, things are changing in India.
mhm,
The figures could change even further. That's a ray of hope. Now,
mhm,
Meghna, what would be, there's so much more I can talk about, but given the constraints of time, I wish you to conclude with some conclusive suggestions on the theme
mhm,
of the discussion today.
mhm,
In
mhm.
fact, the last word uh, from would be from you before I officially give my vote of thanks. So you can take your time and say whatever you wish to say on the discussion, on the theme of the discussion, and a few last words.
Thank you, firstly, Rumki, for having me. I feel I've barely scratched the surface. There's so much to
I
talk, but
agree
of course,
so much.
we this is a topic that's ongoing and it needs ongoing research, ongoing dialogue, ongoing policies, good policies, not just policies. I think one thing that I found in my research too is a question that I constantly keep asking myself. We have these fantastic laws. Most parts of the world, including US, of course, we have the Civil Rights Act, we have Equal Pay Act, we have all of these. But why do we continuously persist with these discriminatory behaviors? Why are we seeing women not rise to these roles? So that question of, despite great policies, why are we faced with these challenges, is where my research and my interest lies. So I think, what does one do is the question. First step is you have to create awareness of these biases. These biases exist across, whether it is at the individual level, whether it is at the organizational level, whether it's at the society level, right? So we have these both conscious and unconscious biases that we must focus on. We have to address the toxic cultures in our workplaces that allow some of these gender stereotypes to perpetuate. So we have to question that. We have to increase transparency, whether it comes to recruiting, whether it comes to evaluation, promotion, salary, all of these things. We have to be very transparent. Um, some of these policies, as you mentioned, are viewed as accommodations, right? It's any of the when women take time off, or for instance, in the US, it's called the FMLA, Family Medical and Leave Act. All of these are seen as accommodations. I think as long as they'll be viewed as accommodations, they'll be seen as something that's not serious enough, or that women are not capable enough to rise to that next level. So we have to really unroot, I would say, some of these narratives that have sustained some of these hidden organizational gender biases that we see in our places. We have to have role models, for instance. So I think that's very, very important as well. So I'd like to almost concluding, say that diversity goals, right, whether however we want to diversify, is not about just the number of women that reach these senior positions, but about the quality of work and the environment of inclusion that we create, where these women actually can be successful and thrive rather than fall off that cliff. And that's kind of a defeatist purpose there, because we have bought these women in these roles, but we've not nurtured or created an environment where they can actually thrive. So that's very important to see. So always kind of pushing that boundary, and seeing, um, uh, are we penalizing women for maybe acting, dressing, talking a certain way, or are we penalizing those who may choose to have children or even not choose to have children, right? We have to see both of these things. So I think we have to really adopt a very liberatory, conscientious approach in our workplaces, in our societies, where I would say we have to address issues of power and privilege that create some of these exclusions. So I would urge all of us to work towards that, whether it is bringing gender equality at the forefront, reproductive rights, violence against women, abuse, all of these issues as we celebrate the International Women's Day, I think remain front and forward, and we have to be talking and doing more and more research about these.
Thank you, Meghna. It was wonderful talking to you. I
Thank
mean,
you.
one woman professor to another. This
Yeah.
was a wonderful dialogue, and especially in the context of Women's Day, I seriously believe that these are substantive issues,
Yeah.
policy issues,
Yeah.
and there is a lot of research going on, and
Yeah.
more research should go on
Yeah.
on the
Yeah.
statistics that are given
Yeah.
out to us. We need
Mm.
to understand and go beyond that, you know.
Mhm.
So I would like to conclude by saying that women's empowerment is like the proverbial glass that is currently half full, fraught with
Mm.
opportunities as well as challenges.
Yeah.
Past women's movements, you know, have shown us that have really shown us the way, in the
Mhm.
sense that we have now to build on our strengths. When women are
Mm.
educated,
Yeah.
employed, independent, confident, and productive, society and economy gains. And with it, everyone gains: parents,
Mhm.
husbands, employers, and the state. Therefore, all have a role to play in this movement for a gender
Mhm.
equal and gender
Mhm.
just society, which does not
Yeah.
exist anywhere in the world today. I'm very
Yeah.
clear about that. Let's
Yeah.
not be country
Mhm.
specific. That goal
Mhm.
is yet to be attained. It doesn't
Mhm.
exist at all. So, you know, we need to have a focused fight that involves
Mhm.
government, the private sector, and civil society. To educate women is only
Yes.
half empowerment. The rest
Yeah.
half happens when they go to work.
Yeah.
So, thank you, Meghna. Thank you for coming and giving us so much time despite your busy schedule. It was
Oh.
wonderful sharing our thoughts. We both could share our thoughts with each other, and these, especially on Women's Day. So
Yeah.
I would thank our viewers for watching, and we'll be happy to receive your comments and observations on the comment section of YouTube. Please get back to us with your observations. Both of us will take these very seriously,
Yeah.
and today being Holi in
Mm.
India, I would like to wish a happy Holi to all our viewers, Indians and others across the globe. So, wishing you a very happy Holi and namaste from
Mhm.
Rumki Basu in this Global Policy Talk 3. And I wish Meghna also a very happy Holi. So please get back to us in the comment section. Thank you, Meghna, and happy
Thank
Holi to you.
you. Thank you, Rumki. Thank you. And a very happy Holi to you. If I may say one last thing, that this is a quote that applies to, I think, all contexts globally, by Michelle Obama, who I truly admire. And she, in fact, said, no country can ever truly flourish if it stifles the potential of its women and deprives itself of the contributions of half of its citizens. So I think that may aptly represent our International Women's Day, and a good way to end this. So I again thank you. I appreciate you and your time. And happy International Women's Day and happy Holi, everyone. Take good care.
Thank you, Meghna. Thank
Thank you
you.
so much. Thank you.